By 1922, it had become clear to the government that if no new orders were placed, the Royal Air Force would become ineffective. Britain would lose the gains made during the war in aeronautical development and would eventually lose its aircraft industry. It became policy for the Air Ministry to identify an operational requirement, describing what an aircraft would be used for, and from this followed a specification. The aircraft companies would be paid to develop prototypes, and a fly-off would ensue at a government test establishment. It was also possible for a manufacturer to develop a prototype at their own expense, known as a private venture, which would then be evaluated by the ministry. A design by new chief designer George Carter gained Hawker Engineering its first production contract for a new aircraft since 1918. The Woodcock II was a night fighter built to Air Ministry specifications. Woodcocks were ordered by the Royal Air Force to replace the now obsolete Sopwith Snipes, allowing the company again to describe itself as designers and constructors of aircraft to the Air Ministry. A new chief test pilot was appointed to replace Harry Hawker. This was Fred Raynham, one of the early Brooklands aviators who had been an instructor in the Sopwith School of Flying. In 1922, Fred Raynham was participating in the first Round Britain King's Cup air race in a Martinside F6, when he became aware of the talents of Sidney Cam, who was working as part of the support team. The same Sidney Cam who had first seen Tom Sopwith on the day he landed at Windsor Castle in 1911. Sopwith was later to say of Cam, "He was the finest designer of aircraft there has ever been." In 1923, on Raynham's recommendation, Cam was taken on as a senior draftsman working under George Carter. Sidney Cam was an aviation enthusiast who had managed to turn his hobby into a profession. From a working-class family in Windsor, he left school at 14 to apprentice as a woodworker. His interest in aviation developed at an early age through the construction of flying models, and he was a founder of the Windsor Model Aeroplane Club. In 1914, Cam joined the Martin and Handyside Company based at Woking and Brooklands. Martinside, as it subsequently became, was one of the early aircraft companies and a rival to Sopwith Aviation. He initially joined as a shop floor woodworker, but soon his design talents were recognised and he was promoted to draftsman. He worked 6 days a week and on Sundays would travel to the Agricultural Hall, Islington, to sketch captured German aircraft on display. Such a leap from the shop floor to the design office was highly unusual at the time. At Christmas 1915 he married Hilda Starnes, who was the sister of a fellow member of the Windsor Model Aeroplane Club. During the hard times after war, Martinside, like Sopwith Aviation, had to make other products, such as motorcycles, to make ends meet. In 1920, however, the concern went into receivership. George Handyside started a new firm in 1922 with Sidney Cam as draftsman, and they designed a competition glider for Fred Raynham, so making the link which eventually led him to join Hawker Engineering. Cam's first design for Hawker was the ultralight Cygnet, which placed very highly in the Royal Aero Club's light aircraft competition in 1924 at Lympne. This success underlined his talent as a designer and his credentials at Hawker. The Cygnet was piloted by George Bullman, who became chief test pilot in 1925. He became a key person in the company in the interwar years and led a team of test pilots who travelled around Europe demonstrating Hawker aircraft. He was well known for flying in his trademark Trilby hat. With Bullman at the controls, the Cygnet went on to win the 1926 Daily Mail light aeroplane competition. The company had not seen success in competition since the days of Hawker, and it was an achievement that impressed Tom Sopwith. In 1925, George Carter moved to the rival Gloucester Aircraft Company. Sopwith then appointed Cam to the vacant post of chief designer, meaning that he had risen from the shop floor to this position of industrial importance in just 11 years. It was a classic example of Sopwith's skill as a manager for choosing the right person for the job. Cam's next project re-established the company in the export market. The Hawker Horsley, named after Horsley Towers, was his development of a George Carter design for a torpedo and day bomber. It was the first Hawker aircraft which featured metal construction. The Horsley was too large to be transported by lorry and had to be towed on a specially designed rig. The Horsley became front-page news in 1927 when it was chosen for a project inspired by Lord Trenchard for a non-stop flight from Britain to India. It took off from RAF Cranwell on the 20th of May 1927, narrowly missing a perimeter wall, and covered 3,419 miles before having to make a forced landing in the Persian Gulf. The Horsley therefore briefly held the world long-distance record. On the 21st of May, Charles Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget, Paris from New York in the Spirit of St. Louis, a distance of 3,590 miles. Metal was now replacing wood as the construction material for aircraft, and Cam and Sigrist invented a system of metal airframe construction which became the basis of all Hawker structures until the mid-1940s. This involved pressing circular tubes to a square section where there was to be a joint, a process known as swaging, and then making the joins with flat steel plates. Any size or length of tube could easily be swaged square on simple machinery. This avoided any need for specialist welding, which Cam hated. The resulting airframes provided a robust structure that could be quickly assembled, like a piece of Meccano, by a non-specialized workforce, while still ensuring quality. It was the success of the Hawker Hart light bomber, however, that really changed the company's fortunes and made it once again a major aircraft manufacturer. Following an Air Ministry specification, Sidney Cam devised an aircraft with a top speed of 184 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour faster than any fighter then in service. The Hart design formed the basis for a family of specialist biplanes, such as the Demon, the Hardy, the Osprey, and the Hind, all adapted for slightly different roles. These variants were sold all over the world. The speed of the Hart was a wake-up call for the Air Ministry. Strategic thinking in the RAF in the interwar years was dominated by the Trenchard Doctrine, the theory that attack was the best form of defence. In practice, this meant possessing a greater deterrent bombing capability than the enemy. The political establishment, recalling the German raids in the First World War, did not think Britain could withstand attack from the air. Stanley Baldwin expressed this in Parliament in 1932. "There is no power on earth," he said, "that can protect the man on the street from being bombed. The bomber will always get through." The theory that the aeroplane was not a defence against the aeroplane led to a lack of resources being put into fighter development. Had it continued, this would have resulted in a rapid defeat for Britain in the Second World War. The fact that the Hart, a light bomber, could outfly any fighter alerted the air marshals to just how inadequate their fighter force had become. Production could not keep pace with demand, and Vickers at Brooklands were one of 8 companies with few orders for their own aircraft who built Hawker Harts under licence. It was a smart move by Sopwith to mop up excess demand for Kingston designs through the use of subcontractors. It allowed him to keep the Kingston operation relatively small and gave the company some protection should the market again contract. Orders for the Hart and their variants flooded in from the RAF and foreign governments. The Demon was a two-seater fighter version of the Hart. Hart variants were extensively deployed during the late 1920s and 30s throughout the British Empire, serving in Persia, Iraq, Egypt, and on India's northwest frontier. The Osprey was the naval version, which had folding wings, could be fitted with floats, and launched by catapult. It was ordered by the Fleet Air Arm for use on the 3 Royal Navy aircraft carriers. To his staff, Sidney Cam was a hard taskmaster, known for his ability to give an instant and bowel-turning dressing down to an errant draftsman. At one point they wrote a letter to Sopwith complaining about Cam's authoritarian manner. Sopwith said of him, "I can't imagine why his men put up with him. He was a genius, but quite often impossible." One remembered that Cam certainly kept people on their toes. He was wonderful at motivating people, more by fear than anything else. They recognized that behind the facade was a design genius who had turned his team into the finest in the British aircraft industry. Prime ministers were temporary nuisances and chiefs of staff were to be pitied for their boring clerical jobs, but if you designed fighters for Hawker, you were a prince among men. Cam was a great believer in small teams and would make a daily tour of all drawing boards in the office. He was a perfectionist where design detail was concerned, personally vetting every drawing. He hated a bent plate if a flat plate could do the job. It was not unknown for him to rip up a drawing and throw it on the floor if a draftsman presented him with a shoddy piece of work. Over time, the young gentlemen of his design team came to savour his stream of caustic wit and insults, particularly if it wasn't aimed at them. On accountants, "At a pinch we could do their jobs, but I'm damned if they could do ours." On a poor draftsman, "He couldn't design a lavatory seat. That takes real skill." Cam was characteristically critical of his previous designs, and always looked to hone them to their essentials. A redesign of the Hart as a single-seat fighter produced the Hornet, renamed the Fury by the RAF, who wanted it to sound more ferocious. It was the first RAF aircraft capable of flying at more than 200 miles an hour. He had an obsession with eliminating any superfluous detail, and the Fury, elegant in shape and simple in construction, carried all his hallmarks. He believed that if an aircraft looked right, it would fly well. Advertisers were keen to associate their products with its sleek lines, and it became a design icon in the 1930s. Both the Fury and the Hart used the new Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. It was the demand for Hawker biplanes in the 1930s which established Rolls-Royce in the front rank of aero-engine manufacturers. The RAF ordered the Fury in numbers, and by 1932 Fury squadrons formed the elite force of Britain's air defence. It was the only aircraft with a performance superior to Hart bombers, and it too spawned a family of variants. The overseas sales were greatly increased by the tours of the 3 company test pilots, George Bullman and his deputies, Philip Lucas and Jerry Sayer. They demonstrated the capabilities of the aircraft all over the world, bringing them to the attention of foreign governments and air forces. By 1932, some 84% of all aircraft in service with the RAF had been designed by Sidney Cam. Sopwith realised that Cam knew better than the Air Ministry what the RAF should be flying. Sopwith would explain to the people who mattered the advantages of Cam's various designs, and the Air Ministry would write a specification around his ideas. Other air manufacturers hardly got a look in. In Cam's words, They couldn't see our arses for dust. The Hearts and Furies remained in service until the Second World War, when they were made obsolete by the development of monoplane fighters. However, the biplane era of the interwar years was remembered as a golden age of flying. More than 3,000 Heart and Fury variants were built, and their success laid the foundation for the company's expansion. Sopwith sought extra capital by the formation of a public company, and in 1933, with no more pretence at general engineering, the company became Hawker Aircraft Limited. In the mid-1930s, Tom Sopwith was much occupied with his other great passion, sailing. In 1934, he entered the America's Cup in his sloop Endeavour and came close to winning for Britain. Less was now seen of the skipper, as Sopwith was known in Kingston. He ran the Empire from a London HQ and now used his new industrial muscle for a major expansion. In 1934, he purchased the Gloucester Aircraft Company, which owned one of the largest factories in the country and also an airfield at Huckleycote. Production of Hawker aircraft began at Gloucester the same year. At Brooklands, which the company had used since 1913, production capacity was improved and a new erecting shop was constructed at the southwest corner of the circuit. It was built facing the flight sheds and was slightly kinked along its length to match the curve of the racing track. Airframes were trucked here by road from Kingston for assembly and were brought through a tunnel underneath the circuit banking. The Brooklands shop came into operation in 1935. In July of that year, there was a more dramatic expansion when Sopwith bought the large Armstrong-Siddeley group from J.D. Siddeley, Lord Kenilworth. Thus was formed Hawker Siddeley Aircraft Limited, which in addition to Hawker and Gloucester now included W.G. Armstrong Whitworth Aircraft, the Armstrong-Siddeley Aero engines, Air Service Training, and A.V. Rowe, the large Manchester-based concern which produced Avro aircraft. The constituent companies continued producing aircraft under their own names, as well as sharing manufacturing work throughout the group. At one stroke, Sopwith had created a powerful conglomerate that for the first time brought disparate parts of the aviation industry together under one umbrella. Sopwith remained in charge of Hawker Siddeley as chairman until he retired in 1963. Later in his life, Sopwith was asked what his most frightening moment had been. "The day I wrote a cheque in favour of Lord Kenilworth for £2 million, and I didn't have the money."